Thank you, thank you. Thank you so very much for having me. There's a very special energy in this room. It's lovely to be with you. You're so kind and warm and gracious to each other. And you're also very open to each other. So it's a real pleasure to be here. So this topic, I realize, may be a bit new or unusual to your group. But I think it's one that stays with all of us, as our childhood is such a fundamental part of our lives. And I think that many people struggle to discover, well, what makes for a successful adult life? And oftentimes, childhood is one of those spaces that's explored. For example, there's the perception that if it's a challenging childhood, it makes it much more difficult for a successful adulthood. And that can, of course, be very true, right? And so then there's the question of, well, how do we overcome a childhood that has its own versions of trauma to be healthy and engaged adults? Now, I think there's a lot that we do in terms of covering as well with our childhoods. So there can be a childhood that is traumatic and we just simply look past it and don't deal with it. And it comes out later in multiple ways. I think early on when you ask who has married their mother or their father, right? That's one of the ways in which that kind of papered over childhood ends up resulting in what we do in adulthood, or when people act out in a variety of ways. Well, I've come to think about this topic because I'm writing a memoir. And it's a memoir that friends have asked me to do for a long, long time. And I put it off. I thought, well, who would want to read it? Who would write it, right? You know, all of those things. But this friend who really encouraged me to launch this memoir knows that I left home when I was 15 years old and became an emancipated minor shortly after my 16th birthday. I didn't intend to become an emancipated minor. Actually, it shows the naivete that I had. I thought, well, I could just move back to New York, enroll in school, and that in New York, they're just so happy for people to go to school that no one will ask questions about where are your parents. I really thought that, right? You know, there must be such a hunger for people to just be in school. Who wants to ask questions about how you got there? Little did I know. And so this friend who knows this story and some others said, you know, this really needs to be written about. And so that will be my next book. All right, so what is it about this childhood that I want to share with you and then think more generally about childhood? I think that there's a lot to be said about not knowing that you are a victim of a thing. When I grew up, I was an only child, and I was born in Wisconsin and I grew up in New York. And probably what anchored for me a very loving aspect of my early years was having the privilege of growing up with older people. And that is my grandparents, both sets of my grandparents. And to this day, I have a natural affinity with older people. I just do. I was delighted and honored as a child. You know, I was of that generation with my grandmother. My grandmother's where you don't speak. You learn how to listen, right? And that's just simply what you do. My parents were off living in Montreal. Their parents said, go and be successful if that's what you want to do, and we'll take care of Michelle, the only child. And so I lived during the week with my maternal grandparents and on the weekends with my paternal grandmother. And the benefit of that time was just tremendous. As a little girl, these were women who had mostly hailed from the South, and they were the leaders of their communities. They made things happen, and they would have their coffee, and I remember, you know, just delighting in my grandmother putting a little bit of coffee in a saucer with milk in it. And I was like a kid, and I loved it, and I felt I was there. I was with them, and their conversations. And what was so interesting And I must say, in terms of what actually brought me here, Toby heard me at the Newport Beach Library when Isabel Wilkerson came to speak, and she's the author of a book about the African-American migration from north to south, right? The Warmth of Other Suns, where she tells this story about African-American, she documents it. She's a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, and she documents the tragedies of Jim Crow, which we know about, those horrible, horrible things where lynchings were not uncommon, where there was second-class citizenship, the denial of individuals, the right to vote, and so many other things. And she talks about their journey northward, which wasn't always a panacea in and of itself. Well, my grandmother and these women were part of that migration. My maternal grandmother was from Mississippi. She grew up in a time when black women were not expected to even go to high school. They were not expected to go to college at all. Their families were preyed upon in very vicious ways. Her youngest brother escaped the South in the trunk of a car to get away from a lynch mob after having been cut down. It was only after my great-grandfather's funeral that I saw the cut and burn at the back of his neck. Well, this was the history from which my grandmother and many of these women came. But what was fascinating, and what I think is a route to being able to have a loving life, is having early expressions of love in one's life. And this, I suppose, is part of the beginning of my story. And that is, despite what those women encountered in their lives, and we know this shameful history, we may have it papered over in many different ways, but despite that, I only knew love. I never once heard a hateful, racialized word from these women who came from histories where everything around them was to tell them that they were second-class citizens, right? When you think about what Mississippi did to Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, those three young men who went south to help people vote, and they were murdered, and their bodies were buried in, in a swamp. And it was because two of them were Jewish that their families could pressure the government to make sure that they were found. This is the narrative of those women's lives. But for me to be in their presence and never hear about hate at all. I mean, you could think that it would be logical that someone would say and instill someone with fear, right? A child with fear about these things. But I never had that. And it served, I think, as such a powerful lesson for me because it allowed me as a child to have a very open heart about love and about people. And I think that that is critically important in one's life. The other thing that I think was really important is that these women, there was something important in the spirit of things. And here I'm not talking about religion per se. I'm talking about a spirit of something that opens one's heart to serendipity in other people, right? When your spirit is just simply open to love and other people, it allows good things to happen. Well, that in fact was good for me. And I should talk a little bit about my paternal grandmother before I get to the more traumatic parts with my parents. And that is the difference between my two grandmothers who had enormous respect for each other, enormous. My maternal grandmother, as I said, came from the South and all of that. And she was the kind of stereotype of a woman who was the church-going woman with the big crooked hat and the opaque stockings, and who had a table that was always open for anybody. And I carry that with me today. Anybody can always come. I mean, come over, eat. All of you, you're invited. But that was her. There was always more than enough for everybody at her table. It's something subtle, but it remains with me, this openness. Something else that remains with me too is a principledness that she had. And this church-going woman story resonates with a quick short story that I want to tell, and I want to talk about my paternal grandmother. I remember one day that there was a rapid knock on her door. And she opened the door, and there was a young man who was panting. He was young. He looked like he probably was, he wasn't yet 20, and I don't know what else he was. I could just sort of, from a child's perspective, and and it was as if she knew what to do right away because words really weren't spoken, and what she did was this to me. Shh. I don't know that she knew that person. He was not familiar to me. She put him in a closet. And all of this was happening, and I'm wondering, what in the world is happening? She's in a closet, she's told me shh, and I know the rules when she says shh. But then after that, there's another knock on the door, and it's a police officer. It's a white police officer. This young man was black. I had never known my grandmother to be a dishonest person at all, and she was one of those people that didn't drink, didn't smoke, real virtue type of a woman. And the officer asked if this person had been seen and did we know where this person was. And the officer looked at me and I looked at my grandmother and I remembered, shh, and I said nothing. What was that? And I never forgot that either, right? Reconciling this woman who's such an honest person, but there's a person who's in this closet. Well, years later, it would make me think about other stories, other times in which there have been people out on the look for people. And I don't know if this young man did something wrong or not, but my grandmother was astute enough to know that there were injustices in the world, and that night there could have been a grave injustice that was going to happen, and she was not going to stand by it. My paternal grandmother, on the other hand, was a woman who took me to the ballet. And she took me to the ice capades and all of those things. And I have to admit, I love her dearly. Those weekends were kind of boring. Not the ice capades and the ballet, I love that. But afterwards, we would fold lacy things and we would sit and listen to classical music as we folded things. And we would go to bed listening to classical music. And that was my evenings with Evelyn, my grandmother. But when their children came back, their children were very different than they were. My mother and my father were very hungry people. Very hungry people, and I've used the term narcissism to describe them as well. The benefits of having the grandparents that I had and the love that I had from them and a kind of openness led to a perfect kind of naivete for me, because when I was about 9 years old, my mother left on a vacation without telling me. I had no idea that there was a word such as being abandoned. I had learned to be self-sufficient. By the time that I was 7, my mother had decided that she was kind of, done. We were more like roommates, and I had adjusted to that as fine, right? My mother she redesigns the house, I redesigned my bedroom, and that's how we are. I remember a bus ride that we had coming back from my mother seeing her therapist, and I remember leaning on her. I was a leaner as I walked, I was a leaner as I sat, and I remembered my mother saying, "Michelle, don't lean on me." And it had that profound kind of double effect for me in hearing that. Because of course one could think about it at the moment of the leaning, but it also says something too about how we navigate our relationships in terms of reliance. In fact, shortly after that time is when I began to learn how to cook for myself. And it was very interesting. In life we have these guardian angels. And I had guardian angels both in the present physical form and not in the present physical form that protected me in ways that were good for me, because they protected my integrity as well as a child. They really did. When someone gives something to you, but they don't say, "Now I'm giving this to you." And one of those lessons was when my mother was with her girlfriends, and one of them was a cousin, and they were playing bridge or cards of some sort. And I asked my mother, I said I was hungry, and would she make something for me? And again, one of those guardian angels said, and I think I was about 6, turning 7 at the time. And she said, "Well, Michelle, you don't know how to cook yet? Oh my goodness, you need to know how to cook. And I thought, cook? Little did she know, I would need, in fact, to know how to cook. She intuited something, and she didn't disrupt my mother and my mother's sense of where she thought my mother would be heading. And she didn't in any way disrupt something for me, but I had weekends with Marguerite. And Marguerite allowed me her entire kitchen to make as many pancakes. And I mean, my goodness, I would make stacks and stacks of pancakes. I would experiment, flour everywhere. And Marguerite was so generous with that. Oh yes, the pancakes. Oh, learn how to do the eggs, all of this. Because, in fact, it would come a time very shortly after that that I really did need to know how to cook and how to take care of myself. And I did. So I was actually, in a very strange way, prepared when my mother went on this vacation. And to be honest, I don't recall if she left a note. She may have, in fact, left a note that she had gone on vacation. I don't know, but I came home and I was able to cook. And for the few days I did that until the food ran out. Now, I have to say, I mean, this is not the story of a person living in any kind of poverty. I had a mother who had discovered disco, and she loved disco, and she loved life. She was living her life. And I have to say as well, she was also struggling from things that she probably had not yet addressed in her own childhood and her marriage. And I should say that in the years that she was with my father, that was not an easy life for her. It wasn't. I remember the year that we all lived together as a family when I was about 4 years old, and I remember the trauma of the heartbeat of them thumping each other. I remember my father being so upset that my mother threw her big diamond ring down the trash compactor and said, "I'm done," and the pummeling. I remember my father talking about how grateful my mother should be given where we lived. We were the only black family. Well, there was one other black family in our neighborhood. They had very high fences. So I never saw them, but I knew on the other side there were some black people who lived there. But we were the integrators. And they had so much trouble within themselves trying to hold all things together. Well, shortly after my mother left and I spent my time with Marguerite, my grandmother, the paternal grandmother, went looking for me because it was Easter time and she needed to give me my Easter basket, which is how she discovered that my mother had left. And I, in fact, hadn't heard from my mother since she had left on her vacation. And of course, an important thing is that I had no knowledge of or consciousness of an abandonment at all. I didn't interpret any of that. That was probably very helpful for my life, very, very helpful. Well, the long and short of it is that the Easter basket leads to a move from Wisconsin to a move to New York to live with my father, who was a bit of a ruthless type of a businessman. You know, my father, he saw green, and that was pretty much it, you know. I would not say that he was a person who cared very much about social justice. And he was a man that on one hand actually was very good about some things that we would call good about parenting. He cared about my schooling, my education, and I think both of my parents cared very much about those types of things. So in those ways he was good. But in other ways, he still was the kind of demon that he had been with my mother, right? And I experienced all of that. This all led to a day when I was 12 years old, right? Where I heard earlier during the birthday celebration people talking about the new phases of life. I think that my life probably flows in 12s because I remember being 12 years old and really asking myself, could I do this on my own? Could I live by myself? Could I take care of myself? Began this sort of thinking about what does it take to be able to take care of yourself where you're free from the recklessness of the other people who happen to be around you. And that really stuck with me. I had hoped that I would actually have been sent to a boarding school so that I wouldn't have to deal with either of my parents. But what my father did is rather than sending me to a boarding school, he sent me back to live with my mother. And I went to live with my mother when I was 13, turning 14, and by that time my mother was a severe alcoholic. a severe alcoholic who had also discovered cocaine as well. And she was actually a successful businesswoman, strangely enough. But it was very hard. I remember, you know how you learn just enough to, for things to be dangerous in your mind? Well, I knew about too many people who were alcoholics or drug users who died in the middle of the night. So I basically didn't sleep very much during the years in which I lived with her because I was fearful about her dying in the middle of the night. I was fearful about her choking on herself as she would throw up from a belly too full of alcohol. So I slept on the edge. My husband, in fact, says, yes, I can blame your mother now for the late nights you come to bed, right? And that couldn't sustain. And for a brief period of time, I went back and forth between New York and Wisconsin. Which parent could I live with? And then I finally decided when I was 15 years old, I was through. I was entirely through. I decided and I announced to my mother, and I don't think that she took me seriously. I said, at the end of my sophomore year, I'm leaving. I will be leaving and living on my own. And she didn't believe me, so she ignored it for most of the year. The very idea of a 15-year-old, what are you going to do, right? What skills do you have? What are your capacities to be able to live on your own? And as the second semester of my sophomore year was coming to a close, and I think that she was beginning to wonder, maybe just slightly, was this possible? Would Michele really be leaving? She took me to see someone named Aunt Stella. Now, Aunt Stella had been married to one of my relatives, Uncle James, who is one of my grandmother's maternal grandmother's oldest brothers. And Aunt Stella was a kind of seer person, right? So my mother took me to the seer. And I think she hoped that Aunt Stella would scare out of me this kind of notion that I was leaving. And I have to say, my mother was going to try to bribe me as well to try to stay. She'd offered me a car. And so Aunt Stella said something that resonated with me. She said, child, you will go from pillar to post. That's not necessarily a bad thing, and I think it was true. I travel a whole lot. I think I do go from pillar to post. And I left. When I left home with a plane ticket from Wisconsin to New York and $10 in my pocket. I had taken jewelry that I had received from my father over time, and as a teenager you can't enter a pawn shop, you can't pawn something, so I had to have an 18-year-old or someone over 18 to do that for me. And I pawned what I had because the instinct and intuition for survival was pretty darn strong for me. And I knew that I could not rely on either of my parents for that. They were strong people in their own ways, but they were people who were also very self-indulged. Now, there are questions from the back of this. I've told you how much I love my grandparents and my maternal and paternal grandmothers, and then what happened with their children. Well, we could talk about that separately. But I pawned those things. I got my plane ticket, and I headed to New York. And in fact, I was $20. Well, I borrowed $20 from a friend of my mother's, and she never forgave that person. Sure. But I wanted to have, your grandparents would tell you keep a quarter in your shoe. I figured I needed $10 in my pocket. So, and that took me to New York. And then from there, the story was, as I started, I registered for school, and this is what led to my emancipation and to thinking about issues in law, and thinking about issues in families and so many other things. After I registered for school, I got a call from the school, and the school asked, they said, you need your parents' signature. We've got this card, and we need parent signature. And I said, well, I don't live with my parents. And you're probably wondering, who did I live with? I had a friend who was heading off to college, and her mother had space in her attic. Now, this was very different for me because when I was growing up in New York, I was taken to school in a Mercedes every day. I went to private schools. But for me, I had learned something very early on from those women, those old Southern women around that long table, and it was just that something about integrity. And that integrity is something that even if you have to go without, it's worth doing, going without, so that you can keep your own self-dignity, respect, and integrity. So I enrolled in a public school on Staten Island, which is where this woman lived and had her house. And so shortly after getting the call from the school, you have to have parents. I told them I don't have parents. And they said, well, why aren't you living with your parents? And I told them, now again, this is naivete, because if I were shrewder, I would have, I don't know, not said what the truth was. Because I was not looking to harm my parents. I just simply wanted my own freedom. Shortly after I hung up, a social worker called from the state of New York, because of course then you investigate things such as what I shared, right? Serendipity, right? So ultimately I did become emancipated, and I did have to learn how to tell my story. And I also realized too that process of becoming emancipated was not easy. There was a social worker who was assigned to me, and every week we would have to meet, and every week I would have to share all of this childhood of these two people. And interestingly, in the day in which court took place, my father had left the country, and my mother was there with two lawyers to try to get me back. And I remember the look on my mother's face and the tears streaming down her face, and I just wept. I just wept. The judge called for a recess. The social worker took me out to lunch. And while smoking and blowing smoke in my face, she said, you know, I finally believe you. And I thought, every week I've had to be subjected to you. What is it about humanity where it's not until we're very demonstrative, where we have to look like we are just lost all that we have, and in tears, where suddenly we say, now you have credibility. There's something wrong in that, right? There's something wrong in, I think, the sense, particularly I think with women, right? But it can be anybody. The sort of sense that if you stand up tall and you stand up with your dignity, that in fact that must mean that you don't have your own vulnerabilities too, right? Or that you can just take it all. Anyway, I must say, and I'd like to turn my talk to the point about serendipity, because clearly, I mean, fast forward, and you've heard I've written lots of books. I'm a law professor who's well known around the world. I work on issues of human trafficking, and someone mentioned body parts. One of my first books was about body part trafficking, all of that, right? So the end story is good, and the beginning of it helps with that end story. But I have to say, being open and loving and serendipity works, because when I landed myself in Staten Island, I needed a job. I mean, I realized, okay, the things that I wanted to do, I needed to have an education. And I realized that with all of the cacophony of my mother's life, it interfered with my education. If anything, right, the sort of dealing with a mom who was suffering from her own addictions and trauma, and my lack of sleep at night, interfered with my schooling. I mean, I guess I really am a nerd at heart. So I needed that, and that was something very important to me, an education. Fulfilling my education. And even in an environment that was completely new. I had never, attended a public school like I attended in Staten Island. And I was very open to it. Wow, was it fascinating. Boy, was it fascinating. I thought, wow, and all these different cliques of people, oh, how interesting. The people, Caribbean Americans that are there, the Italian Americans there, all of that. I thought it was just absolutely great. I was one of those kids that enrolled for every hour of the day. I had no lunch period. So I would bring my lunch to my physics class, right? And I would love it. And sometimes my professor would say, yes, Miss Goodwin and her tuna sandwich, But I loved it. All right. But serendipity, I needed a job. And so this gives just a taste of how I believe that serendipity can work in life, and certainly has in mine in a number of ways. I mean, even the pathway to my own freedom had lots of serendipity. But I was walking around with a newspaper thinking about, how am I going to get a job? I need to work someplace. And I was walking up a hill, and there was, and this sounds kind of biblical, but there's a guy, he was pruning his shrubs And there was a hill, and his house was elevated off of the street. And again, with the grandparents I had, you learn good manners, right? Good manners. Now, I don't remember if he said hello first or if I said hello first, but the next thing that was said, do you need a job? And I said, yes, I do. He said, my wife is Dr. Nina Mazer. You can look her up in the phone book. I said, thank you. And I worked for Forrest Golden, who was an engineer, and Nina Mazer until I left high school. And again, with serendipity, and I cleaned their home. And the funny thing about this is that the one thing that both of my parents complained about is that I was lousy at like washing dishes, cleaning the house. I was a neat person, but they said I was lousy at that. But that was my job, and I took it so seriously. I took it absolutely seriously. And their kitchen had white marble floors, and I wanted those white marble floors to be sparkling clean. I did not feel it was a compromise of my dignity at all to make sure that their floors were clean, despite the way in which I grew up and what I had been accustomed to. And also, little did I know the backstory that I would learn from my time not living with them, but basically living of their space with them. For example, that Dr. Nina Mazer had not always been on a path to becoming a medical doctor. In fact, a very famous medical doctor. She had been a dancer earlier in her life. She had had a troubled first marriage. This was her second marriage. Little did I know until I found out along the way that in fact she didn't go to college until she was in her 30s, and that it was her sister who really impressed upon her to just try to get her out of the house, to encourage her, just take a class in basket weaving or anything, Nina. And she did. And I think it was around 40 that she went to medical school. Now, what was interesting is that she never told me the story. It was as her children would come in the house. But those little pieces were, in fact, such inspiration for me, learning these lessons about people and how they can thrive even in the face of adversity. And so that was a very, very special place and moment for me. And I have to say, as I begin part of concluding, because we could spend all day with me and my story, is that I became far more aware during that period of my life about the way in which other people encounter and confront struggles, including becoming sensitive and thinking about the stories of my mother as well. Now, I have to say that ultimately I became estranged from both of my parents, but I did really try to be open to them and their stories. In fact, I went back to live with my mother for a brief period of time before going to college. I had planned to go to Dartmouth for college, but I actually went to the University of Wisconsin because my mother lived in Wisconsin, and I wanted to get to know my mother better. There wasn't necessarily a silver lining that came out of that. But I'm not the worst for it either. And I have to say that when we blossom where we're planted, which is what I did at the University of Wisconsin, I became the youngest person ever elected to the presidency of the student government, the first person of color, youngest woman, all of those things. I was elected out of my freshman year, actually, so my sophomore year. I had a $6 million budget to run. The state of Wisconsin is one of 3 states that has what they call shared governance between the students and the university. And in part, you might recall the stories at Wisconsin of the bombing of buildings in the 1960s. Well, it all grew out of that. But there was a consciousness that I had because of my own life. And I spoke up about things, and I'm sure that that is what, in fact, led to that election and to so much that blossomed for me when I was in college and then later in law school. I didn't step away from opportunity. I used opportunity and doors opened for me because I was willing to be present. And also because in my life I've come not to like bully so much. And it's not that I just go after bullies, but I believe that it's very important to stick up for people who are not privileged, who may be vulnerable. And it doesn't mean that we always have to go out of our way to find that fire, but it is that fire is right in front of us. I find it disheartening to walk past someone who happens to be in need. And I think because I've lived my life that way, I've had various opportunities that have come to me. Where am I now? And of course there are gaps in between, and we'll take a few minutes for Q&A. I'm happily married. I live in Laguna Beach. I have a wonderful daughter who is in graduate school at Stanford. I have a stepson who's in Washington, D.C. I have had a very blessed life. And I attribute so much of the foundations of that life, in fact, to those early days of those incredibly wise women around the table. And I emphasize that again because one of the things that I share with people that I think of truly, truly as a law professor, and is that when we think about who our heroes are, oftentimes we think of the people who've written the books about themselves, and of course I'm saying that I'm going to be writing a memoir, but I'm talking about the kind of old heroes of law, or the people that we think about who wrote the Constitution and whatnot. But I think about the people who made our Constitution real. And a lot of those people who made our Constitution real were a lot of those women who sat around the table. Those were the women who were willing to sacrifice whatever they had to support people to be able to have the right to vote, who gave up their farms and other things that they could have so that an education could be real. Those were the people who underwrote all of the civil rights litigation. They really did. I mean, there weren't big philanthropists at that time saying, here's this big check so that you can make sure that swimming pools are integrated or that parks are integrated. It was actually those church-going women and their husbands who made those incredible sacrifices. So when I think about my own life, where I am today, I owe so much to them, their openness, their love, and also their creativity as well. And with that, I'm going to close. Thank you so much. Yes, questions. Thank you, thank you. Thank you very much. Yes?
Time for questions?
Any question? It's fine. Okay. Okay. That's a lot. And, you know, it's a lot, yes.
Thank you for your sharing. And obviously your consciousness was greatly expanded by these wonderful women in your life and by the adversity.
Yes.
And the choices that you made without that adversity.
Yes.
Was there a spiritual component? Obviously the one grandmother was maybe a Southern Baptist or something.
Yes.
Took you along. But then also added to, you call it serendipity, there are many names for that kind of guidance. And I would just be interested in
Sure.
that story.
Well, you know, that's a great question. So both of my grandmothers were steeped in religious traditions. And I have to say, I didn't follow those paths in terms of church going and whatnot. But I will tell you this. In my life, I've been very judicious with how I've used prayer. I believe that there is a power of a prayer, of a harmony, right? And I will say, I'll give you an example of a time in which I used a prayer to the universe. Shortly after my daughter was born, and I've been married twice. This was my first husband, who's a chemistry professor. And I'm an only child. He had two brothers. And I just thought, oh my goodness, I want my daughter to have aunts. She needs aunts. I had this sense that if something ever happened to me, I wanted my daughter to be fine and to know that there were people who loved her. And other stories that I would fill in between would be the stories of the aunt showing up at a particular day that meant a lot for me in my life. So anyway, I make this prayer as we're moving from Boston to Kentucky. She needs aunts. And it was as if three shepherds appeared. They really did. The three aunts, she has one, Mama Ann. Her Mama Ann was the daughter of the pastor who presided over the 16th Street Baptist Church in Alabama. You know, that is the church where the 4 girls were blown up on a Sunday. Nancy Stage was another very prominent member of the local Lexington community who actually ended up becoming my boss in a way. And another woman, and all within a space of about a month, serendipitously. And here's a funny thing that brings them all together. These women hadn't seen each other in years, but each of these women had 2 daughters. Each of their 2 daughters were all the same age, and in each case, the oldest daughters all went to a co-op that they helped to create. And they hadn't seen each other in years until I arrived with my daughter, whose name is Sage. And that brought them together. Like, oh, I know her because back 18 years ago, our daughters were together and we were together in a co-op. So anyway, the power of the universe, it does happen. And I know another instance in which that happened, actually surrounding my daughter, years later when we were moving to Chicago. And I asked the universe that I needed someone to come take care of us. And I wanted it to be a gay man, you know. So who asked that, you know, for a gay man, you know, to just come and just take care of us? And my daughter did have a man, and he did arrive on my doorstep, right? I mean, I met him through somebody, but it did happen, you know. She had a Mr. Troy. And so while other kids had au pairs and nannies, my daughter had Mr. Troy, and he was fabulous. He knew how to do hair very well. So if I needed to leave early and she needed her bun to be done for ballet, the only question that I would ever get is Mr. Troy would call, "She wants a double bun. You told me a single bun." And I say, "Okay, it's okay, Troy. It's okay, we can do a double bun." So there you have it. That's how I've seen prayer. So.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you much for sharing your story with us. It's really wonderful to hear how you have managed throughout your whole life and how what serendipitous things have happened for you. And I'm curious, you're a law professor over at Irvine.
Yes.
So how do you see the students today?
So this is a very good question. So I think that young people are struggling more today, or maybe they're not. Maybe there are ways in which people papered over or learned how to cope in different ways. But there's the articulation more that we see of young people in struggle. And I would say that this is not just a knowledge point of here, but I have taught at the University of Chicago, the University of Minnesota, and here. When I was in law school, we had a person who was a half-time dean of students. She was a law professor, half-time as dean of students, and that was it. Today, before I left the University of Minnesota, I think that there were about 8 to 10 people who were in that office. Right, so things are different. Now, how much of it is that there are a number of reasons for that. So do we know that it's all that young people are struggling more, or is it that we're being more attentive and aware to try to help them as they cope along? There may be a number of things in that packaging, but I will say that my experience as a law student appears to be different than many of the young people that I'm seeing today. Thank you so very much for having me. And Toby, thank you so much for inviting me.
Absolutely.